This is Jacob's Algebra, Chapter 12, Lesson 1. We are finally finished with fractions, and we are moving on to squares and square roots. So in this lesson, we talk about if y is equal to x squared, then y must be the square of x, and x is a square root of y. Notice I said that y is the square of x, and x is a square root of y. The reason why I say that is because every positive number has two square roots. If we wanted to find the square root of 121, what can we square to get 121? Well, 11 squared equals 121, but negative 11 squared also equals 121. So the square root of 121 is plus or minus 11. Now, most of the time when we are asked for the square root of a number, all we need is the positive root. So most of the time, just the positive root will work unless you're asked to solve an equation, like solve the equation y equals x squared. What is x? If y equals x squared and y equals 121, what are the possible values for x? Well, in that case, x would be plus or minus 11. So if you had to graph this, your two data points would be negative 11, 121, and positive 11, 121. You know, the x coordinate and then the y coordinate. Okay, so things that you should know. The square of 0 is still 0. The square root of 0 is also 0. For Algebra 1, we will say that a negative number does not have a square root. So the square root of negative 4 is not possible. Now, in Algebra 2, you will learn how to do square roots of negative numbers, but that's beyond the scope of an Algebra 1 course. So in Algebra 1, square root of a negative number is not possible. Okay, so let's look at some sample problems from this lesson. Okay, let's start with number 4. Number 4 says list all of the square roots of each of the following numbers. Notice it says all. That means you must list the positive square root and the negative square root. So if we have 49, we need to know what is the square root. All the square roots. That's going to be plus or minus because this is 49. That's a positive number. And what do we square to get 49? 7. So a positive 7 squared is 49, and a negative 7 when we square it is 49. So our answer to 49 is plus or minus 7. You can write that as plus 7 comma minus 7 if you would like. Okay, let's look at part C. Part C is the square root of negative 4. That one is going to be not possible. In Algebra 1, we do not know how to take the square root of a negative number. So if what's inside is negative, then it's not possible. Okay, let's look at part E. 0. What is the square root of 0? That's just a 0. 0 is not a positive number. Remember, all positive numbers have two square roots. 0 is not positive. It's not negative either. It's in between the positive and negative numbers. 0 has only one square root, and that is 0. Let's do one more part. Let's jump back and do part D, square root of 900. To find the square root of 900, that's the same as the square root of 9 times the square root of 100. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 100 is 10. So that is actually 30. You can actually punch this into your calculator to get the answer. So that was number 4, which is just like number 12 that was assigned as homework. Oh, wait, this is plus or minus 30 because we've got to give the positive and negative answers. Okay, let's look now at number 5. Okay, number 5 is just like number 13 in the homework. It says use the table of squares and square roots on page 563 to express where possible each of the following is either an integer or a number in decimal form. Round answers in decimal form to the nearest hundredth. You can actually use your calculator. You do not have to use the table of values. When this book was printed, not all that many calculators had a square root button or a square button. Most of the calculators were just regular 4-function calculators, and they couldn't do what our calculators can today. So let's do part A. Part A says 45 squared. So if we look on page 563 and look in the first column for 45, the second column gives the square, and that is 2025. Or you can just punch this into your calculator to see. Let's look at part C. Part C is the square root of 45. Well, we can go back to our table that we just used and look in the first column for 45 and then go across to the third column, and the square root is 6.708. But it said to give the answer to the nearest hundredth. This is the hundredth place. So we want to round to the hundredth place. That's 6.71. If your answer is not rounded, is not an integer or rounded to the hundredth place, then you have not actually done what the problem has asked for. It says give your answer as an integer, or if you have a decimal answer, give it rounded to the nearest hundredth. Okay, let's look now at part E. Part E is square root of 6,084. If you're using the table on page 563, you look in the square column, which is the middle column, for 6,084. And when you do that, you will find that it lines up with the number 78. So the square root of 6,084 is 78. Or you can put this into your calculator and hit the square root button. Really, nobody should have any problems with this one. And then we're going to do, actually, I'm going to jump back and do part D. We have square root of -54. That's going to be not possible because we don't know how to do negative square roots in the square roots of square root of negative numbers in Algebra 1. Okay, we're going to do one more, and that is part G. And part G says 7.2 squared. Well, if we look in our chart, that's not actually in our table of squares and approximate square roots. So that is one that you would definitely want to do on your calculator. When you put that in your calculator and round it to the nearest hundredth, it's going to be 51.84. Remember, for number 5, which is number 13 that's assigned for homework, if your answer is not an integer, then you need to round it to the nearest hundredth. So make sure you round to the nearest hundredth because your answer is not fully correct until you do so. Okay, so now let's look at problem number 6. Problem number 6 is going to be just like problem 14 that was assigned for homework. It says, between what two consecutive integers are each of the following square roots? So let's look at part A is square root 10. You can either punch that into your calculator or look at your table of squares. Look for 10 in the first column. Go across to the square root. You can see that square root 10 is 3.162. So that means that the square root 10 is between 3 and 4 because it's bigger than 3, but it's smaller than 4. Okay, let's jump down and do part C. Part C is negative of the square root of 3. This is possible. The negative is outside of the square root. We don't know how to take the square root of a negative number, but we can take a square root and then multiply it by a negative. So we're going to look in our chart, square root 3. The square root of 3 is 1.732. We have a negative in front, so it's negative 1.732. Negative 1.732 is between -2 and -1. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is part E. That's the last one we're going to do. Square root 124. You can punch that into a calculator or look it up in the chart. 124, oh, actually that's not in our chart, so you have to do that in a calculator. The square root of 124, 124 square rooted is 11.1355. So I'm going to round that, well, it doesn't matter, 11.14. So that equals 11.14. And so that's going to be between 11 and 12 because it's bigger than 11, but it's smaller than 12. So that was number 6. it is just like number 14 that was assigned as homework. Remember, a negative in front of the square root is allowed. A negative inside the square root is not allowed. Okay, so now let's look at problem number 7. Number 7 is just like number 15 that was assigned as homework. The first part of number 7 says find the squares of the following numbers. So part A is 8. What is the square of 8? Well, that's 64. Most of you have that one memorized. Part B, 80. What is the square of 80? Well, you might look that up or you might punch it in a calculator. If you do either one of them, 80 is going to be 6,400. Notice we had 1 0 here. We have 2 zeros there. Let's look at part C. 800. Oh, sorry, I should put the square here. What is 800 squared? Well, if you punch 800 squared into your calculator, what you'll get is a 64 with 4 zeros after it. So this is 640,000. So we have 2 zeros here, and that becomes 4 zeros there. And then part D is 8,000 squared. And our answer is going to be a 64 with 6 zeros after it. So it's 64 million. Notice we have 3 zeros here, but we end up with 6 over there. So that's finding the square of a number. You just punch these into the calculator. Now the second part of number 7 says find the square roots of the following numbers, correct to the nearest integer. So round to the nearest integer. To the nearest integer. Okay, so what is 36? We're going to look at part E, 36. If you take the square root of 36, that's just 6. Okay, what about the square root of 360? Well, when you take the square root of 360 and then round that to the nearest integer, you're going to get about 19. Because when we pull up a calculator and we type in 360 square rooted, we get 18.97. And so that rounds to 19. Okay, part G, we have square root of 3,600. Well, we pull up a calculator again, type in 3,600 and square root it. We're going to get 60 this time, and that's an exact answer. We'll do one more, part H. This time we'll do 36,000. So we put that into a calculator, 36,000, and we square root it. That's 189.7. So the closest integer is 190. Okay, so that was number 7. It's just like number 15 that was assigned for homework. You shouldn't have any problems with this one. For the first half of number 15, you will be finding the square. For the second half, you will be finding the square root. Remember to round to the nearest integer. We are not rounding to the 100th for this problem. We're rounding to the nearest integer. Okay, now we're going to look at problem number 8. Problem number 8 says the following table lists some approximations of square root of 126. To the nearest tenth, we have 11.2. To the nearest hundredth, we have 11.22. To the nearest thousandth, we have 11.225. And then some questions are asked about this. For part A, it says square each of the numbers. So I'm just going to write squared for each of these numbers. So 11.2, when we square it, is 125.44. 11.22, when we square it, is 125.888. 11.225, when we square it, is 126.001. These are all things that you type into your calculator. Part B asks, which of these are smaller than square root of 126 and which of these are larger than square root of 126? So which ones are smaller than the square root of 126? That would be 11.2 and 11.22. Because when you square them, you get numbers that are less than 126. Which one is bigger? That's 11.225. So 11.2 and 11.22 are smaller. and 11.225 is bigger.